Hello and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Lee Kaplan. What does it mean to pursue liberation without romanticizing the past? Can modern science, historical materialism, and even ideas associated with European modernity become tools of anti-colonial struggle? And what might the revolutionary thought of Amílcar Cabral have in common with Palestinian writer and intellectual Ghassan Kanafani? Joining me today again is Zeyad El Nabolsy, assistant professor of philosophy at York University. His work focuses on modern African intellectual history, African philosophy, the history and philosophy of science, and anti-colonial political thought. We first turn to Nabolsy's work, Amílcar Cabral's modernist philosophy of culture and cultural liberation, where we examine Cabral's relationship to modern science, modernity, and modernization, and his insistence that ideas or practices cannot simply be dismissed as Western because of where they historically emerged. This raises larger questions about reason, progress, language, cultural autonomy, and whether something introduced through histories of conquest can eventually become endogenous to a society. In the second half of our conversation, we bring Cabral into dialogue with Palestinian political theorist Ghassan Kanafani. We discuss historical materialism, the Palestinian revolt of 1936, and the failures of post-colonial nationalism, Afro-Arab solidarity, and the relationship between Palestinian and African liberation movements, and Cabral's famous demand for the revolutionary petty bourgeoisie to commit what he called class suicide. If you like what we do here, please become a patron at patreon.com/everythingisideology or give a donation at buymeacoffee.com/everythingisideology. Hello, my name is Lee Kaplan, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm joined again by Zeyad El Nabolsy, who has a PhD in Africana Studies from Cornell University, an MA in Philosophy, and a B in Chemical Engineering from McMaster University. Zeyad is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at York University. His main area of focus is modern African intellectual history. His dissertation, Science, Modernity, and Progress in 19th Century West and North Africa, a comparative study of Africanus Horton and Raphael El Tawi, seeks to answer the question, how does our understanding of the role of modern science in African societies change when we cease to ignore the early reception of some of the modern sciences by 19th century African intellectuals such as Africanus Horton in West Africa and Raphael Tahiti in North Africa prior to the scramble for Africa? Excellent. So it seems like a lot of your dissertation and the words I just said are words that we're going to essentially be repeating in different ways. Specifically the words of science and modernity, and also this notion of progress and what it might mean. So we're going to talk about two of your works today, specifically focusing on Amílcar Cabral. And also we're going to get into his connection with Ghassan Kanafani in different ways, as you suggest in one of your articles. So I was hoping that we could start by talking about the piece you wrote for the African Cultural Studies Journal called Amílcar Cabral's Modernist Philosophy of Culture and Cultural Liberation. So I guess just grounding us, what are you trying to do in this article that hasn't necessarily been done? Or rather, what are the tensions you're trying to resolve in this piece vis-a-vis thinking through Amílcar Cabral's theory and philosophy as a sort of something that could be systematized?
Yeah, thank you, Lee. That's a good question. So, Amílcar Cabral has, of course, received some scholarly attention all the way back in the 60s and 70s, right, when he was active. But I think compared to somebody like Frantz Fanon, for example, the secondary literature on Cabral in the Anglophone world really uh, uh, hasn't grown as much, right, on Cabral. Now there's a bit of resurgence in interest for sure. But basically what I wanted to do in that piece is to say that Amílcar Cabral has an implicit philosophy of culture, and by that I mean he doesn't present himself as a philosopher. Indeed, Cabral doesn't even like to present himself as somebody who's defending general theories. He thinks of himself as a very pragmatic individual. Of course, he has values that he adheres to and so on, but he always presents himself as somebody who's very pragmatic, and he has this engineering background, this agricultural engineering background, right? So um, that's all to say that to be able to distill a philosophical view from his writing takes a little bit of work, right? So I basically look at his pronouncements on culture, on various aspects of culture, which are often targeted towards different audiences, right? So he'll address party cadres, so members of the PAIJC, the party that led the liberation struggle from Portuguese colonial rule in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. And he'll also address the UN Council, right? He'll also address intellectuals and activists who are sympathetic to the struggle, whether that be in Milan or Sweden, right? So he's always addressing different audiences. He also addresses African Americans when he's making a tour of the US. So you have to, of course, calibrate and realize he's addressing different audiences. But all of that to say, so setting that aside, what I wanted to do in this piece is to say that, look, when we actually look at what he says about culture, he has this very anti-essentialist, anti-traditionalist conception of culture. He doesn't think that liberation, and especially cultural liberation, amounts to a defense of what people can label, traditional African culture. That was the key point I really wanted to make.
Nice. And yeah, that comes across really well. Definitely when I was reading this, and just a question I had just overall kind of in grad school, to the point where if you even engage in something like Frantz Fanon, why don't you engage in something like Amílcar Cabral in the same way? Because fragments of kind of philosophy and whatnot have appeared and been systematized in different ways, even in looking at like the classics, or thinking about like the skeptics, or even in revolutionary praxis, something like Gramsci, right? He's like almost the king, to a sense, of the fragment. And we have a systematized understanding of him in different ways. And so there's definitely something to be said. I'm curious as to like why that might be. Perhaps you could touch on that. But I was also just wondering, when he addresses these various audiences, it seems like some of the things he says are in tension with one another, but you discuss how they're actually not necessarily a tension. They're a feature of something very particular of Amílcar Cabral that's underpinning all of his sort of thought, and that's this adoption in many different ways of something called modernism, and the philosophy of modernism. Can you discuss some of the main tenets of that, and then the ways in which Amílcar Cabral sort of utilizes it?
Yeah, so you can take what Jürgen Habermas calls the philosophical discourse of modernity, right? So he has a series of lectures, and they're kind of a historical analysis of this modernist discourse. And of course, to subsume a lot of thinkers under this category of philosophical modernism, you probably have to specify its components in a way that still allows these components to apply to different people. So there is a level of generality, right? Because after all, you want to say that Locke is a modernist, Marx is a modernist, Lenin is a modernist, Diderot is a modernist. You get the point. Kant and Hegel, of course. But Habermas says, well, look, there is some kind of unifying elements to this discourse. So first of all is this emphasis on individual freedom, the individual's right to shape their life as they see, as they wish. Of course, it comes along with, for some people, there is this negative conception of freedom. Some people also try to synthesize it with a positive conception of freedom, right? That freedom is not just doing whatever you want, but also being able to do the things that you ought to do, right? That's one way to think about it. So that's one component. The second component is this orientation towards the future, right? So the idea is that we're building towards the future. Our models are not really in the past, right? We're not trying to return to an earlier moment in human history. We're trying to build up on human history, but to go beyond what has been achieved so far. And the third one can be stated again at a certain level of generality is this idea that, human reason has to be the standard of adjudication and normative justification. And that's, kind of vague, right? But it still marks out people who adhere to this modernist discourse when you compare them to somebody like Edmund Burke, who just doesn't trust human reason that much, doesn't think that it works this way, doesn't have this power, it leads to disaster if you just follow human reason. Right, so these I think are the components that you see expressed in what Amílcar Cabral says when he talks about culture, when he talks about the relationship between humans and nature, when he talks about the future-oriented nature of the struggle against colonialism in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, when I was thinking about this, I thought about sort of our last conversation when you went over various critiques of Black Marxism, and when there's these tenets or these sort of things that we know, rather than being these categories that are there forever, we have categories that are kind of changing and used for different things, right? So the idea of modernism and subjectivity, the centrality of reason, for Cabral, he uses these things to call towards like kind of liberatory ends. So these concepts aren't necessarily static, and you define him kind of as a pragmatist. And that seems to be the case in his relationship to culture, to the law, and to like notions of kind of liberation and freedom and whatnot. So would you mind talking about a little bit about sort of like how this appears to be a tension where drawing from the discourse of modernity for liberation movements seems to be in tension with one another, because these are the very same logics that led to colonial expansion and extractivism in the first place. But so how is it possible that Amílcar Cabral could be a quote unquote modernist, considering modernism is the thing that's subjugated?
Yeah, no, you're right. So there is definitely tension there, right? So for example, Amílcar Cabral does adhere to this idea that humans should no longer be terrified of nature, right? And I think I have a passage in the article where I quote him. He says something to the effect, we shouldn't believe that part of what it is to be African is to be afraid of the powers of the river or something like that. I can't remember the details, but so some people, of course, say, well, look, this idea that humans should overcome their fear of nature and perhaps even dominate nature, right? So this kind of Promethean ideal that takes on a modern guise in the works of somebody like Francis Bacon, right? And you could say, well, this is, first of all, it led to justifications of imperialism insofar as, the indigenous inhabitants were kind of identified as part of the fauna and flora of that environment, right? So they're part of nature in a sense. They don't really transcend it, right? So they just live this natural existence, which is a kind of ahistorical existence, right? On the pre-Darwinian view of nature, it's just, an eternal circle, basically. So you could think, well, yeah, there is some kind of association here. But I think Amílcar Cabral would say, well, look, that's just a historical association, right? It's not a relationship of conceptual entailment, right? Which is what it would really need to be for it to be problematic in the deep way in which some people want to identify it as problematic, right? That's, I think, the onus is on people to show that actually it's not just a matter of coincidence, of historical coincidence or historical association. No, but actually, if you adopt X, you have to also adopt Y on the pain of contradiction. And that's, I think, what Cabral refuses. He says, well, look, I could still think that it's a good idea for humans not to be terrified of nature, without thinking that this leads us to first of all, the idea that we should dominate some people because they are somehow part of nature in a way that their conquerors aren't. But second, you could even say, well, look, it's a good thing to get rid of our fear of nature, of this notion that nature is unpredictable and all-powerful and all of that, while still rejecting the idea that humans ought to dominate nature, right? So getting rid of fear is one thing. thinking that we're godlike creatures who are destined to dominate nature because we transcend it. That's a wholly different thing, right? And you might think, look, there is no justification for the second view. It's bizarre and it's dangerous, of course, ecologically dangerous. And Amílcar Cabral himself, just to talk a little bit about his own practices, while he had this modernist approach, he wasn't uncritical of certain things that people associate with modernity, and specifically modernity in the guise of a particular theory of development, namely modernization theory, uh, associated with the work of Rostow and so on. So Cabral, for example, thought that large-scale monoculture is a horrific way to run your agricultural system. It depletes the soil. It makes your society dependent on the global prices of one commodity, so makes you very vulnerable for to transformations in the market that way and shocks in the market. Deprives you of the capacity to feed yourself as a society, right? So let's say you specialize in cacao or something, you cannot eat like cacao. You can eat a little bit of chocolate or something if you learn to manufacture it, but it's not a staple food by any means. Right. So he had this, discerning approach that shouldn't be overlooked, I think.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really helpful. And I know that a lot of he did like sort of radio broadcasts when he went back to Guinea-Bissau and talked basically to the masses via this radio program that got canceled by the ruling Portugal elites about understanding their localized conditions in agriculture and what's going on agriculturally. So he definitely was involved with that. I was kind of thinking in terms of this fear of nature. I was actually thinking in terms of sort of African religious and spiritual practices and utilizing and drawing on those spiritual practices insofar as they could help various aspects of science and development for their particular society. So rather than thinking about like being scared of nature, I thought of it in terms of like actually thinking about it through what Amílcar Cabral might think of as reason, rather than just like an unknown deity that's doing things or something. Like here, I feel like various forms of kind of African spirituality and a critique of what's useful and not useful could come in. Like what I mean is sort of you talk about institutions, right, and drawing on pre-colonial traditions and whatnot in the African context for Cabral, and you write that he uses them insofar as they're useful for the project of liberation. And I think later on we'll end up getting to cultural autonomy and stuff like this. But that's kind of what I mean. I don't know. What do you think of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, again, I think Cabral, and this is a good thing about Cabral having this pragmatic approach, is that he doesn't make general pronouncements on African religions. So when he's talking about fear of nature, he's talking about, a specific belief of a specific ethnic group or set of ethnic groups. And then there are other passages where he talks about beliefs such as the existence of malevolent spirits in the forest. And he says, well, look, and here he's trying to convince a bunch of guerrilla fighters to take cover in the forests because, of course, the Portuguese have air power, which is supplied by NATO as an organization as well, right? There was a whole alliance, if you will, directed against the anti-colonial struggle in Guinea-Bissau. And he says, Cabral says, look, if it's very simple. If you really don't take cover in the forests, you'll just die. Because if you're out in the open and the Portuguese have area superiority, the end result is pretty obvious what will happen. So to this extent, he thinks that there are some beliefs that have to be overcome because they're harmful to human beings. So they're not just false, they're also false and harmful, because you could think that maybe even if you believe that there are no spirits, right, there are no spiritual supernatural entities, you might think in some cases that belief is not so harmful, right? It's kind of benign. And you might say, well, look, on these grounds, there is no need to confront it. We don't need to antagonize people unnecessarily or something like that. But in this case, it's leading people to die, right? So there is really no way to avoid this confrontation. Another case Cabral discusses is this belief And again, none of these beliefs are uniquely African or anyway, right? I mean, these beliefs have been, they're part of the kind of ideological superstructure of various societies at various points in human history. Right, the beliefs that there are malevolent spiritual entities in the forests. You find that amongst Germanic peoples. You find it everywhere, basically. The other belief he discusses is this belief that there are charms or talismans that can protect you from bullets. Again, the belief in protective charms, that's a universal human belief. There is nothing uniquely or specifically African about that in any way. And Cabral says, well, look, if you start behaving recklessly because you think you're protected by this charm, it will be very obvious that you're going to die, and your fellow gorilla fighters will see that the people who are behaving recklessly are dying despite the fact that they're wearing these talismans. Of course, Cabral is oversimplifying, right? Because somebody could say, well, look, in principle, if, let's say, I'm wearing this charm and you see me get shot in the heart, right? And this charm is supposed to protect me. It's not, obviously the case that you'll make the inference that, look, this charm doesn't work. We thought it worked. It doesn't work. There are what philosophers of science call auxiliary hypotheses, right? So there is the belief that the charm works, but there is also the belief that the charm works only if these conditions are met, right? It was actually made or created by somebody who has the requisite spiritual power, the requisite spiritual discipline, that you yourself are following that person's instructions. So maybe you see me die and you say, well, look, this is not evidence that the charm doesn't work. This is just evidence that the person who gave this to Ziyad isn't really a qualified person, or Ziyad didn't follow his or her instructions. So it's a bit more complicated than that, but I think, of course, with repeated failure, at a certain point, you'll exhaust this approach of appealing to auxiliary hypotheses, and you have to confront the reality that, the core belief there is suspect.
Yeah, no, I mean, that brings to mind all of the various stories of like the Bible stopping the bullet and like all of these different sort of pop cultural myths that can happen in different ways. But it's interesting because I was thinking of, well, this talisman stopping a bullet, right? If you like combine this, if you take like talisman, if you have a dialectic of talisman plus science, which I kind of want to ask about now, you'll have something like a bulletproof vest, right? So I think a bulletproof vest perhaps could be thought of as a form of a scientized talisman in different ways. I don't know if you'll necessarily agree with that. But that gets into like my sort of questions with the relationship between science and politics within Cabral's sort of thinking, because you have a few different paragraphs, not necessarily an entire section, on the question of science and science as an embodiment of rationality in different ways. And science takes up this, I don't know if you were thinking of it in terms of like sort of just modernity or Hegelian, like the, science of logic sort of thing. But would you mind talking about the role that science plays within Cabral and modern philosophy?
Yeah, so I didn't mean science as like just the German Wissenschaft, which refers to any organized body of knowledge. I meant science, specifically modern science, as it emerged, say, during and in the aftermath of the scientific revolution in early modern Europe. And of course, there was science before that. So science as an organized, systematic attempt to understand natural phenomena, predict them, and eventually control them. That's something that humans have tried to do since, Homo sapiens evolved, basically. Probably before that, I don't know, probably Homo erectus was trying to sort that out too, likely. Now, one of the, so there are several distinguishing markers of modern science when you compare it to, say, ancient Egyptian science or ancient Babylonian science or whatever kind of, or ancient Greek science for that matter, right? So first, you get this heavy emphasis on the mathematization of nature, right? So Alexander Quarry talks quite a bit about that in the 50s, I want to say 1950s. you also get this heavy emphasis on experimentation. And again, experimentation took place in various cultures in various times in human history, but it becomes really systematized and tethered to this mathematization of natural phenomena in a clear way during the early modern scientific revolution. You have this orientation towards the future, towards constantly making new discoveries. So the idea is essentially that it's not the case that what we're going to do is we're going to rediscover knowledge from our inherited classical traditions, whether those be written or oral traditions, but actually we're going to have to discover knowledge through interacting in this systematic way with nature. So knowledge is something that you're going to get through future endeavors, right? So all of these things, right? And of course, there are other factors like the social organization of knowledge production, the existence of things like royal societies, the existence of an apparatus for the publicization of the results of experiments, people's capacity to follow and replicate experiments, all of that stuff, right? So the public aspect, the public in a, still limited way, but still a public aspect of scientific discourse. So that's what I meant. I didn't go into the details, and I think I should have gone into the details in that paper, but I had, of course, there are considerations of length, and I mean, this is something I've gone into in my book on Polan Tonji. I go into a little bit of detail on that and on these debates. But the idea is basically, what does Cabral think of modern science here? And he thinks it's a great thing, and it's something that we as Bissau Guineans, we as Cape Verdeans, we as Africans in a broad sense, we have to do our best to assimilate modern science. That's really one of Cabral's core messages.
For sure. And it seems like within that definition of science, to some degree, is subsumed and smuggled in an aspect of kind of a teleology in different ways. And this means that the teleology can be used towards different ends. The teleology could be used towards human flourishing or towards capital accumulation, depending on those kind of tools, not necessarily, and kind of the mode of production, but the ways in which the mode of production is kind of structured, it feels like. And I think that's where Cabral comes in different ways, because he thinks about the mode of production a lot. He thinks of that as the primary kind of starting point for theorizing from a colonialized space and society, specifically in his tricontinental speech I'm thinking about, where he famously kind of articulates the, the class suicide that the petit bourgeois needs to sort of commit if there is to be a revolutionary project. But that's kind of foreshadowing our Kanafani discussion. But there's one thing, there was a distinction you made that I found interesting between types of science, and this was Western science and modern science. Perhaps you kind of touched upon this implicitly with your previous answer, but would you mind discussing those things?
Yes. So I wanted to say that modern science and Western science don't refer to the same thing, right? So if you're talking about Western science and we take Western as just a geographical designator, right? So it refers to things pertaining or things that have emerged in a particular part of the planet, right? So the West, however we want to cut it up, right? And it's tricky because the West kind of expands over time, right? It comes to take over parts of the Americas, Australia, New Zealand. But okay, let's just say, Western Europe, and I don't know, like the borders of Western Europe to the east are the Ural Mountains or something. However you cut it up. And you can say, of course, not all of the scientific discourse that emerged in that part of the globe throughout history is modern science, right? So ancient Greek science is not modern science. Ancient Gaelic science is not modern science, and so on. You get the point. Modern science emerged in Western societies around the time of the advent of capitalism. And of course, there is a complex causal relationship here, but we're going to bracket that for a second. But of course, the fact that it emerged in Western societies doesn't make it, the exclusive monopoly of people from those societies, which is a very, simple point, but it's worth restating because Cabral really thought that you can't conflate the claim that a particular discourse or technique of investigation or whatever you want to call it emerged in a particular geographical area with the idea that it is forever bound to this geographical area. And you can talk about, for example, let's say a technique such as, Arabic numerals, Arabic Indian numerals. Of course, this technique is not developed in the West, but it becomes assimilated in the West, and it's not considered a kind of alien cultural element there because it's been so thoroughly assimilated that it just became part of people's heritage in a sense, right? Even though it wasn't really invented or discovered there, depending on how you used to see it. And today, if you ask anyone in Western Europe to do a calculation using, for example, Roman numerals, they'll probably find it very difficult. And they'll find it alien, actually. So even though it's, a kind of inheritance from the past, it was an inheritance that was discarded at some point in favor of a technique developed in a different set of cultures. And I think, Cabral thinks similarly with respect to modern science in the other direction.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's funny. I usually joke around that the only way we sort of learn and know about Roman numerals here, generally speaking in America, is the Super Bowl. That's kind of the only time within popular culture. And then, of course, if you're doing music theory, but that's a little bit more niche in different ways, right? And then even then, you only do so many. You go up to maybe 7 with Roman numerals, right? But okay, so there's one last question with this modernization, modernity sort of business. And I found that you bring up sort of, you encapsulate some of these tensions in really productive dichotomies. And another one of these dichotomies is you say that the scholarly reception of Amílcar Cabral's work, some of the tensions and misunderstandings within it are those that because modernity is conflated with modernization. Would you mind unpacking that a little bit? I think it's definitely juicy.
Yeah. So I meant in that context, because Cabral says a lot of stuff about agricultural development, about economic development more generally. People think that when, if we're talking about modernity and Cabral's embrace of modernity, we're talking about an embrace of modernization theory. But that's a very specific discourse of development that emerges in a Cold War context. And, its prime theorist is Rostow. I think I forgot his first name. It starts with a W. Rostow, whatever. But he develops a theory of modernization as a kind of oppositional discourse to Marxist theories of development. That's a very specific Cold War context. And today, I think, even today, people conflate modernity as a philosophical discourse in the sense that we talked about earlier, with modernization, which is a specific project of social engineering, based on, systematic exploitation of the countryside for the sake of building up urban centers and so on. All of this stuff that Cabral actually rejects. He rejects the systematic exploitation of the countryside in favor of the growth of the capitalist city, of the capital city. He rejects kind of the unplanned proletarianization of the peasantry, driving them into the city, because of course that's how, if you don't have an industrial base to absorb this surplus population, right, to use this language, you end up getting slums. I mean, if people talk about slums in the global south today in various, metropolitan centers, it's, the product of this unplanned proletarianization of the peasantry that's driving them off their land, but there is no industrial base that can absorb them, and there is no capacity to send them off somewhere else, which is, what the Europeans did when they colonized the Americas, right? You had a surplus population, you just send it over. I mean, the immigration of the Irish, of course, is the paradigm example, right? Of peasantry being driven from their land, sent somewhere else. I mean, if you're Guinea-Bissau, you might think, well, look, if you're in Guinea-Bissau, you think, well, I don't have the industrial base, at least not right now. And there is no unconquered territory that I can just send people to. And of course, something like population transfer is happening, with these waves of immigrants and all of this stuff. And but people, of course, don't want to talk about the economic causes of that, right? So people are talking about it in these purely kind of culturalist/political terms.
No, thank you so much. Another thing that you get into that this understanding of kind of the philosophy of modernism and modernity within this particular context, one thing you get into is his discussions and conceptions of cultural liberation versus cultural autonomy. So another, again, productive kind of binary happening. So would you mind discussing the ways in which Cabral's kind of discussions and considerations of culture have been taken up and kind of like how you rectify these situations?
Yeah, so I think some people have, developed an obsession with the slogan from Cabral, return to the roots, right? So that the intellectual has to return to the roots. It was taken as we have to return to our cultural roots and preserve inherited cultural traditions. Now, I think everything that Cabral actually says goes against that, right? All of the stuff we've been discussing, that this is way too simplistic. Cabral thinks that there are aspects of inherited cultural traditions that are, negative, unjustified, harmful, and all of that. So these things, they have to just be thrown away. There is nothing else to do there. And that's why I think, for me, cultural liberation, as I understand Cabral, has to do with cultural autonomy, which is being in a position to choose which aspects of your culture and other cultures that you accept or reject. Whereas if you're under colonial domination, you don't have that autonomy in the cultural sphere. Certain cultural elements are preserved, even if you don't want to preserve them. Certain cultural elements are denied to you, even if you want to assimilate them. And I think that's really Cabral's key point, that we have to be in a position to choose, and we cannot be in a position to choose without political independence. That's why this question of cultural liberation, which is not equivalent to cultural preservation for Cabral, but cultural liberation requires a condition of political independence.
Right. I mean, you kind of lay this out really clearly, and the idea of like the cultural influence, as I said, and then you specifically say cultural domination. So this obviously gets into questions of language, and you use language as a case study within this piece. So can you talk about this whole the business? This is obviously still kind of a very much something argued still in contemporary journals that you talk about and discuss. And I thought it was really interesting that in the piece, I think one of the people that read your piece at the end, who you acknowledge, is also one of the people you talk about in the piece. So anyway, would you mind talking about Cabral's claim about Portuguese being a potentially African language?
Right. Yeah, so that's we're getting to the heart of the controversial stuff, right? So the discussion about the Africanity of various languages is still, very much a hot topic today. I mean, so one thing I'd wish to say here is that when people discuss indigenous languages on the African continent, they are usually making a contrast or a comparison with what they take to be indigenous languages in Europe, right? That's what they have in mind, that, French is indigenous to French people in a way that French is not indigenous to Francophone Senegalese or something like that, right? And there is some truth to that contrast, but sometimes the contrast is drawn too strongly because people forget that French emerges as a result of the Roman imperial conquest of what the Romans called the province of Gaul. Right? So the fact that French is a Romance language cannot be explained without referring to this act of conquest and then assimilation of the conquered elites, all of that stuff. Now, that doesn't say anything about whether this was, this is normatively good or bad, right? So I'm going to bracket that for a second. But what I want to say here is that we have to develop a realistic understanding of the history of languages in Europe when we're making that comparison. Because otherwise, the comparison, we're going to have a very kind of unrealistic standard of what it is for a language to be indigenous if we think it just springs up out of the soil. Now you have these French speaking people. But that's not true at all. So first you have the Romans who conquer Gaul. Then you have the Frankish invasion, right? So as the Western Roman Empire is collapsing, Germanic tribes come in and so on, and they bring their languages as well. You have the Normans who are Vikings who settle in what is today Normandy. So the idea is that, French actually is the product of these various histories of conquest. And you could do the same with English, just French is the one that came to my mind. So having said that, nobody today will come and say that French is an alien language to this geographical region of Western Europe, right? That would be very bizarre. And even French speakers will not say, well, if you trace my ancestry to just before Caesar's Gallic Wars, you'll find that my direct ancestors didn't speak a Latin-derived language. So I am alienated from this ancestral language. They don't even feel that way at all, right? For them, French is their first language and so on. I'll give you another example. So take Arabic in North Africa, right, which is my first language. Now, Arabic, of course, becomes the dominant language in North Africa as a result of the Arab conquests, right? So in the 7th century, but it takes about 2 or 3 centuries, perhaps a bit more, for Arabic to become dominant in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, so on. Now, today, I would say that, Arabic is my first language. It's the language that I'm most comfortable in and so on. Even though probably if you trace my ancestors on my mom's side, for example, you'll get to a point where I have an ancestor who speaks Coptic as their first language, and then, various forms of ancient Egyptian, probably, in the Hellenistic period, maybe Greek or something. But again, I wouldn't say that I have this experience of alienation from my ancestors' language. I mean, for me, it's not my language. My first language is Arabic. So one of the things I wish to say, and one of the things that Cabral wishes to say, I would say, is that a language can become indigenous over time or endogenous, right? So Paulin Hontonji, who I already mentioned, this philosopher from Benin, has a really interesting distinction between an indigenous element and an endogenous element. So the indigenous element is an element that emerges in that society, right? So that's a matter of history, right? So this language emerged in the society. That said, this is a matter of history. It's indigenous to this society. But Hontonji says a cultural element can become endogenous if it ceases to be seen as alien to that society. So if people assimilate Arabic and they're not from the Arabian Peninsula, they can come to see Arabic as an endogenous element of their culture. And I think Cabral thinks in a very similar way with respect to the case study of Portuguese. Now, there is an added element, of course, that Cabral is concerned with the capacity to train a technically competent cadre of party members. And he thinks that if they don't adopt Portuguese, there is no way that they could teach, for example, thermodynamics. There are no thermodynamics books in Balanta, for example. Now, that's not to say Cabral never says that Balanta, for example, is a language that somehow intrinsically is incapable of being used as a vehicle for studying thermodynamics. That would be absurd. But it would just be too much effort and too much time. Time and effort that you don't really have because you're in this emergency situation, you're fighting a war. And that's why I think the pragmatic component comes back in, and it's really important to highlight.
Yeah, no, thank you. Because it wasn't just sort of thinking through whether or not something is indigenous and the politics of indigeneity. He was thinking in terms of like the science of utilizing a language for a particular end, right? And he had this really sort of interesting thing where he distinguishes between like the population and the people. And within that, he talks about it doesn't really matter what language you speak, right? It matters if you're fighting for freedom and whatnot. You're of the people if you're doing this thing towards liberation, towards liberatory ends, regardless of the language you speak in this particular place, if you are of and with the people rather than the population. So he has this really interesting dichotomy between the population and the people. Would you mind talking about that, the population and the people and the role of language within that?
Yeah, so he draws a distinction between the population. So the population of a country, for Cabral, are just the people who are born in it. Born in it and living in it, right? So they're born in it and they continue to live in it. But there is no political or social project that they subscribe to per se, right? It's just, it's a matter, as a matter of fact, you're born here, you live here in this arbitrarily demarcated area. That's it. That makes you a member of the population of that area. Now, being a member of the people for Cabral involves some kind of political commitment to the project of, in this particular case, liberation from Portuguese colonialism. Now, what this means is that being a member of, adhering to this political project and fighting for it is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for you to be a member of the people. Now, what does that mean? It means that even if you're a foreigner and you volunteer to join the struggle, you're now a member of the people. But conversely, it also means that if you're a member of the population and you stand aside and you don't partake in this project, you're not a member of the people. Right. So basically, that's the distinction.
I think that was really interesting because, again, it gets to this idea of anti-essentialism and historicity that you think is kind of essential for understanding what he's up to and trying to do in this particular historical conjuncture. So that being said, I wanted to kind of turn to your other piece, the Ghassan Kanafani and the Weapon of Theory and Amílcar Cabral, and kind of because now we have an understanding about Cabral. So why did you bring these two together? And also, I hope this isn't switching gears too much, but would you mind thinking, why bring them together, Ghassan Kanafani, and also, who was Ghassan Kanafani?
Yeah, of course. So Ghassan Kanafani was one of the leading intellectuals and theoreticians of the PFLP, so the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Was assassinated by Israeli agents in Beirut. I want to say in 73. I might be off about the date, maybe 72, but maybe 73. And he was a novelist and a playwright, presented the Palestinian tragedy, but also political struggle, right? The two components through the medium of literature. He wrote several important studies of Zionist literature. Now, one thing to note about the PFLP in general is that it emerges as a result of the 1967 defeat of the Arab armies, a defeat which for many people showed the limits of Arab nationalism, especially in its Nasserist expression. So there was self-criticism, if you like, in the aftermath of that defeat, and some people, such as the members of the PFLP and its founder George Habash, thought that one of the explanations for the failure of Arab nationalism is it didn't recognize the importance of stratification by class in Arab societies. It had this nationalist discourse where all Arabs, we all have a vested interest in ending colonialism. For the PFLP, this was too simplistic, right? So they took a more Marxist approach, if you will. Cabral similarly thinks that we could learn from the limitations and failures that the first wave of independence movements on the African continent suffered. So he analyzes, for example, the coup d'etat that led to the deposition of Kwame Nkrumah in 1966, right? So he says, did Nkrumah really understand who are the people, right? So remember, then we go back to the distinction between the population and the people. Did Nkrumah identify who were the internal enemies to his particular political project? To what extent Nkrumah had an adequate or inadequate theory of imperialism or neocolonialism, right? So these are the questions that people are asking, and they're being asked, of course, in the Arabic-speaking world, but they're also being asked on the African continent. There are actually passages in Kanafani's work that make you think that he almost certainly read Cabral. Now, I don't have a smoking gun evidence-wise to point to that, but Cabral's writings were circulating in Beirut around the time in which Kanafani was active, so it's not wholly implausible, since there is convergence in some of their views.
Yeah, so that being said, you were also talking specifically about kind of their theoretical conclusions being quite similar before we dropped out for a second. Would you mind just kind of like clearly reiterating what they were? They both have to do sort of thinking through failure of revolutionary movements because of theoretical concerns.
Right, yeah. So both of them, I think, thought that the kind of first wave of independence movements uh, didn't have an adequate social theory of the colonized societies. They didn't understand that not all members of the colonized societies have the same vested interests in getting rid of colonialism, right? And that there might be a kind of comprador class that benefits, materially from the colonial or neo-colonial relationship, as the case may be. So they really emphasized that you could have a nationalist discourse, that's fine, but the nationalist discourse has to be married or associated with a kind of class analysis of these colonized societies. And I think that's really the fundamental point of convergence.
That's great. Another point of conversion that you get at is both understanding kind of the importance of class analysis within what they're up to, and then also both the methodology being historical materialism as well. That seems to be both incredibly important. Would you mind talking about Kanafani's use of class analysis and historical materialism within some of his works? Because he's brilliant.
Yeah, so for example, he has an analysis of the 1936 revolt, right? So this um, um, revolt in Palestine against British rule. And he tries to show that there was a divergence in interests and in attitudes between the peasantry, who kind of bore the brunt of the struggle against the British, and the kind of urban elites who really didn't want to butt heads with the British. I mean, some of them did, but as a class, if you will, as a social group, they didn't. And he, of course, has in mind subsequent developments in Palestinian history in the 1960s and so on, where again you get a divergence between the displaced peasantry who become, refugees, of course, living in refugee camps, and members of the Palestinian bourgeoisie, or sometimes even, members of the Palestinian petty bourgeois, who adopt a certain conciliatory politics and a certain political discourse that's subservient to the political interests of Arab regimes in the region, who are themselves either dominated by a kind of Arab petty bourgeois class or by reactionary monarchies, right? Those are the two. And so this is where I think the class analysis comes in, both in terms of the analysis of Palestinian society before and after the Nakba, but also the analysis of the surrounding societies.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's an absolutely essential read. Also, just kind of like advertising it in some sort of way. But also, Cabral had some writings, or at least you have large block quotes attributed to Cabral. So, what did Cabral say about Palestine? What was he up to? What was he thinking? And you also mentioned, not having the necessarily smoking gun, but as you mentioned in the piece, Cabral's work was widely circulated within Lebanon at the time.
Yeah, so Cabral took a position on Palestine, a very public position on Palestine several times. He supported the Palestinian struggle. He supported uh, the right to take up arms in defense of their homeland, the right to end their condition of oppression. Cabral thought that there was no justification at all for uh, inflicting punishment on the Palestinian people because of a European sin. So he insisted that the tragedy of the Nazi Holocaust is a product of European anti-Semitism, and Palestinians should not be footing that bill. They didn't commit it. They weren't a significant causal element to it, and that Europeans are kind of trying to outsource uh, uh, guilt by sacrificing the Palestinians. So he was insistent in rejecting that. And he also understood that Israel functions as a kind of forward base to the US and the US imperialist system. That it's the case that the US uses Israel to break up nationalist liberation movements in the region, to maintain its grip on the region. He also recognized that there was an Israeli-Portuguese alliance, Israeli-Portuguese South African alliance against the liberation movements in Southern Africa. So there was a kind of unholy alliance. And therefore, for the PIGC to break out of that situation of encirclement by these forces, the PIGC also has to reach out to progressive liberation movements elsewhere across the globe.
Right. And that being said, something like Maoism comes a lot, or Maoist tendencies and Maoist sort of tactics towards guerrilla warfare and Afro-Arab solidarities. Would you mind talking about Afro-Arab solidarities and also the role of anti-essentialism within that? Because that's something you touch on in the piece.
Yeah. So I think Afro-Arab solidarity had its grounds in this realistic analysis of the world system at the time, right? That the oppressors are helping each other, so we have to help each other in order to stand a chance to survive and to eventually win. And the second aspect to note is that for people who were aware of internal divisions and took them seriously, like Cabral and like Kanafani, there was also the question of, well, we're not going to be allied with any Arab state or any African state or any African group or Arab group. We have to have some kind of political baseline in terms of a shared political project and a shared understanding of social reality and the international reality. And of course, in the African case, you already see there was a split between a kind of conservative Monrovia bloc and a more progressive Casablanca bloc. But the point is to say that in these cases, the division was not ethnic or racial. It was political, right? So the Casablanca bloc included Egypt, it included Algeria, it included Ghana. Whereas the Monrovia bloc included Tunisia, it included Liberia, right? So the divisions are not, Arab versus Black African. The divisions are based on political considerations and various positions taken vis-a-vis neo-colonialism and American-led domination on the African continent.
Yeah, that's great. So it wasn't necessarily about basing one another's solidarity on something essentialist and unchanging or something like this, but rather class positionalities and one's political goals. And it was like, so long as there's political goals aligned, then you kind of create some sort of united front with with this group. And you talk about this bearing out and being true because of the contemporary situation in Gaza, the current iteration of the genocidal process. Would you mind bringing that in? Because you did mention several times, like you wrote it during the aftermath of Al-Aqsa flood. So would you mind kind of talking about how you brought that in a little bit?
Right, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, one thing to think is if you have this idea that political solidarity is based or ought to be based on ethnic kinship, sharing a common language or culture or origin, however you wish to think of it, you might be surprised that almost all of the Arab regimes, with the exception of Ansarullah in Yemen, right, either stood by or actively supported the genocide. But if you have an analysis of class stratification in these societies and who the ruling classes are in these societies and their position in the global system, you would not be surprised at all. Right. So there is, I mean, I was partly responding to this discourse in the Arabic speaking sphere that talks about these regimes as traitors or something, but I don't think they're traitors. They don't think about it in that way at all. They don't think about this kind of ethnic, linguistic, cultural kinship. I think they're acting according to what they take to be their interests are. I mean, I think their policies are very dangerous, and they've led to a genocide and future consequences that are going to be horrific. But I think the kind of moralizing discourse about being a traitor to the Arabs or something, I think that's actually not very useful. We're not actually conducting analysis properly. Um, you have to understand the class position of these people and how they think about themselves and how they think about themselves as members of a global elite where they send their kids to school and so on, right? And once you think about it that way, it's not really surprising at all that they would take the position that they take.
Right. I thought that was incredibly helpful. You're like, no, this is actually the system, and it's going according to system. You said it would actually be rather strange if they took a different position that went against their own interests, which is kind of where this idea of class suicide and kind of like class liquidation or something comes in. So would you mind talking about those two concepts and how Kanafani and Cabral come to the same conclusion?
Both Cabral and Kanafani, they are kind of petty bourgeois intellectuals. So they have a university education. One works as an engineer, the other works as a teacher. They're not from very wealthy families, but in the kind of contemporary sociological discourse, we talk about them as middle class people, right, with middle class sensibilities that are inherited from their parents, if you will. Now, both of them give up certain privileges. I mean, Cabral had a pretty good career, ahead of him. And a quite comfortable life. He gives that up to join the liberation struggle to found the PAIGC. Ghassan Kanafani gives up, a potentially comfortable life in order to become one of the leading theoreticians of the PFLP and the editor of Al-Hadaf, the publication of the PFLP. And both of them end up getting assassinated because of the positions that they took, right? So there is a kind of self-sacrifice element here. Now, Cabral thinks that there has to be a place for a kind of moral discourse or ethical discourse, because if you think about material self-interest, what Cabral and Kanafani do is irrational from an instrumental standpoint. If you wanted to just have a good life and so on, in some basic sense, you probably don't take a set of decisions that end up putting you in a position where predictably you're getting assassinated. Like in both cases, it was not, was not surprising that they were assassinated. Maybe surprising that they were assassinated on this particular day under these conditions, but not the fact that they were assassinated. So Cabral thinks that there has to be an appeal to a kind of sense of duty for some members of the petty bourgeois, so intellectuals, doctors, teachers, lawyers, so on, engineers, to engage in self-sacrifice, you have to give them a moral argument that convinces them to do so. Now, the question is, how realistic is this, and how compatible is this with, a broadly historical materialist understanding, right? So there's this tension, right? Because historical materialism seems to just appeal to a notion of self-interest, right? So why should the proletariat accept this project and adopt it? It's because it's in their material self-interest to do so. But that seems too simplistic, because if you think about, any number of revolutionaries who are not members of the proletariat, right? Mao is not doesn't come from a proletarian background. Che doesn't come from a proletarian background. Fidel Castro is the son of a very wealthy landowner in Cuba. And Castro himself says, I was the second generation. If I was the third generation, I would have probably been, a really rich asshole. And, I wouldn't care about any of the stuff, right? So the model that only appeals to material interests just doesn't have explanatory power, right? And that's where I think this notion of class suicide comes in. But then the question is, what exactly is the moral argument that's being made, which I don't really go into because I don't really have a good answer to that. I think that's a good research question for someone to reconstruct that moral argument and whether it's effective, whether it's a cogent argument or not. But those I think are the key elements here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that brings up so many different things, like the position of the revolutionary as already dead before they're dead in some way. They're both inside and outside of the social structure, kind of going towards a future, right? They're like a martyr figure before they're martyred in different ways. I was kind of like, I wanted to hear more about the potential reasons why historical materialism can maybe account for or not account for sort of like this going against one's interest in different ways. Perhaps this is kind of like something like free will or something, or consciousness realizing itself within the historical structure or something. But this obviously also gets into questions of who's leading the party, because Cabral, or I think you write at a certain point, the petty bourgeoisie needs to sort of like abdicate their role as leaders of the party because, the revolutionary proletariat is the one that'll do it or something. At least that's kind of what I thought you were saying in different ways. Tell me if I'm right or wrong.
No, I think you're right? So it's a complex account in the sense that, Cabral thinks that based on the historical record, you do need a set of self-sacrificing members of the petty bourgeois to commit class suicide and align with the peasantry and the proletariat, but primarily the peasantry. I mean, Guinea-Bissau didn't really have a proletariat at that time. Not a sizable one at any rate. And they will found the vanguard party, but Cabral is also a realist in the sense he thinks that this appeal to a sense of duty, or however you're going to justify this class suicide, it only works for so long and for a specific number of people. It's not really the basis on which to construct the struggle, right? So these people found the party, but eventually the leading cadres of the party have to be members of the peasantry, because then they have a notion of self-sacrifice, but it's also tethered to their interests, right? So interests still loop in and they have a role. So that's why, he emphasizes the importance of making sure that this petty bourgeoisie doesn't stay in power for too long, because just there are too many temptations for them.
Right, of course. That makes perfect sense. And, this idea of the constant vacillation that the petty bourgeois could do, right? They have like the knowledge, the access to stuff, the knowledge of it, but not necessarily close to the mode of production and stuff like this, right? But so I have one or two more questions. I'm going to respect your time. I'll do one last question or something. You referenced something that you wrote, and I thought it was really interesting. And I know I have to probably read the piece and whatnot. But you talked about Kwame Nkrumah's conception of African socialism, and you mentioned that, and I had to make sure I kind of read this right. You said that Nkrumah's framework denied or obscured the existence of class division within African societies. I know this is something else you wrote, but I was kind of interested. I felt like I had to ask you. Would you mind saying something a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there is actually quite a bit to say about that, and Cabral is critical of African socialism. So let me say that you had Marxist socialists on the African continent and anti-Marxist socialists on the African continent, and the latter used the label of African socialism, which is to say they wanted to assert that they're socialists, but their socialism is not Marxist. It's not based on class struggle. It's not based on the recognition of class stratification and all of that stuff. It's based on what they took to be a recuperation of traditional African values. And they thought that traditionally African societies did not have class stratification. Some of them thought that even up to and in the aftermath of the colonial period, class stratification was not that important, right? So Senghor spoke that way, for example, Leopold Sedar Senghor, the first president of Senegal. Some of them thought that class stratification emerged only with the advent of colonialism. So Julius Nyerere, first president of Tanzania, took a view like that. And some like Kwame Nkrumah, again, vacillated. They would go back and forth between whether classes only emerged with the advent of colonialism or not, and whether class stratification is an important aspect of African societies in the post-colonial period. But anyway, no matter how you cut it, you see how different this is from what Cabral says, right? This is why, Cabral has this historical materialist approach that talks about different classes having different interests and so on. And again, part of the motivation behind African socialism, and I've written quite a bit about these debates, but I don't want to go into too much detail. But one of the motivations is this idea that Marxism is an alien European ideological discourse that is not suitable for African conditions. And Cabral rejects that, right? Because Cabral, the same way he would reject the notion that modern science is, uniquely or essentially European, he rejects the idea that historical materialism is somehow only for Europeans or only applicable to European history. For him, it's either an adequate theory or it's not an adequate theory. So that way, we've also looped back into some of the motivations that initiated our discussion of Cedric Robinson in the other episode we did, right? So in a sense, it's all connected somehow,
Yes, indeed. It's all connected. So, I mean, I could probably talk to you forever, but we should more or less end it. I know you have things to do. So before we go, is there anything else you'd like to say that we didn't get to talk about, projects you're working on, et cetera, et cetera?
No, I mean, maybe I'll do some advertising for people who are interested in this discussion of modern science on the African continent. So I have my book, Pola Hontonji and the Science Question in Africa, which focuses on this question. It came out last year. And I have a forthcoming book coming out in January called African Philosophers of Science and History in the 19th Century, which again deals with this question. So I'll just do some self-advertising. If people want copies of these texts, I'm happy to provide PDFs because they're unreasonably expensive. But they can email me and I'll send them a PDF.
That's incredibly kind of you. Thank you so much. I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes, and I'm sure we'll be talking about something else soon.
Awesome. Thank you, Lee.